So we've covered calling methods before, right? Because we use methods from those Java standard libraries. Well, it turns out, things can get a little complicated, especially when we start using shorthand. Once we start looking at the context of classes, right, where that method was defined in. So we're going to take a much deeper dive now that we're building our own methods. So calling a method means, of course, executing the code inside that method. We typically didn't even know what was inside those methods, right? We just called it because we needed it. Now we're actually going to build the method. We're going to define the code in it, and we're also going to call on it. So remember, this is a little bit of review, but we're going to take a deeper dive. So yeah, the classic way to call a method, right, is dot method name. Now we're going to take a deeper dive on what instance and static means. I know we kind of glossed over it last time. This time we're going to take a deep dive. So before we call any methods we create, we must first understand the different types of methods available in Java. So two commonly used method types in Java are instance and static methods. Covered this last time. So the syntax for calling a method will depend on its type. Each type serves a specific purpose, so we're going to take a really deep dive on this. So what is an instance method? It's a method that's associated with an object of the class. So remember, instance methods, you actually have to have an object before you call it. So these methods require you to create an object, aka an instance of that class before you can call them. So there is an exception to this, specifically if you're using an instance method in the same class you declared it in. So there's some shortcuts here. We'll talk about that more, but just know it relies on an object. Instance methods rely on objects. So make your method an instance type if it depends on the state of an object. Are you representing something in the real world, right? And you need to hold on to that information. You need to continue, right, to transform it later in your code. You need to hold on to the state. Again, that'll make way more sense once we're actually building classes. But just know instance methods rely on objects. So methods in Java are instance methods by default. So if you don't actually tell it, what type of method it is, Java is going to assume it's an instance type. For static, you actually have to tell Java it's a static. We'll look at that in the next slides. So this means when you create a method with no special keywords, then it'll be interpreted by Java as an instance method. So all the example methods we created back there, so these over here, random greeting, print names, double two numbers, check temperature, even our calculate dog age, those are all going to be interpreted as instance methods. Um, so there are two situations where you might call a method. And this is going to help us with some shorthand. It's going to be important, especially when we get to classes. So you can either call from inside the class where you created the method, or you might be calling from outside the class where the method was created in. It turns out for inside the class, there are some shortcuts. You don't have to actually, create an object. Because once we get to classes, right, you'll see that when you're working from within the class, you're actually technically working from within the object. And we'll talk about that for the other types as well. So for instance type, when you're calling from inside the class, you can just use the method name. You actually don't need to create the object because you're inside the object if you're inside the class declaration. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Might be speaking gibberish, right? Make way more sense once we get to our Java class deep dive, sorry, which will be in another lesson. And then there's the syntax for calling from outside the class. So this is the one we already learned. You need to create the object, and then you use its name, dot, then the method name, then you provide arguments if there are any. So as already discussed, right, you must create or declare an object before calling a method on it. For the shorthand syntax, the method name only, notice it doesn't have an object in front of it. You can only do it inside the same class. There's another caveat. You can only do that if calling from inside another instance method, which again sounds really confusing. We're actually only going to clarify this asterisk until the end of this lesson. So just bear with me. There is a shortcut, but for the most part, this is the way to do it. Object name dot method name arguments. We'll take a closer look at this later. So if we created our example methods in a main class, we'd have to create an object first. So notice here, we create a main class object. So if I'm going to be using check temperature, double two numbers, random greeting, right? These are the example methods that we created in the last slides. I actually have to create an object first. And if this is inside the main class, it would be a main class object, which seems a little silly, right? Like, why do we got to create an object? Well, that's because they're instance methods. That's how we define them to be. So even though we're calling these from the same class we created them, we're not inside another instance method. This is a static method. We're not going to take a super deep dive on that. Just know we're going to kind of clarify this at the end of the lesson. But yeah, we have to create an object first because instance methods rely on objects. I know we talked about, right? Oh, but if it's inside the same class, can't we use a shorthand? Um, there's some caveats to that. All right, so notice we create the object called app. You could have called it main. You could have called it whatever you want. Doesn't matter. For variable names, of course, has to be lowercase. That's why we don't uppercase app there. So if I wanted to use the check temperature method, I have to do app, which is the object name, dot check temperature. And this works because check temperature was created inside the main class. And app is a main class object. They're compatible with each other. Same with this one. And then, of course, these have arguments, right? Check the temperature. I think this one would be hot, right? This is too hot. This would double the numbers, so the output doubled array would actually be, let me see if I could get my curly braces, would actually be 8 and 14. It'd be an array containing double the value of those two numbers. So yeah, this would actually just print out the first number and the second number. Names, so print names is actually gonna, print out all three names. And then greeting is gonna give us a random greeting here. So app dot get random greeting, app dot print names. And yeah, that's the syntax. Object, instance method. For instance methods, you need an object. We'll talk about the shortcut though later on. All right, so that's instance methods. Now let's take our deep dive onto static methods. So static method belongs to the class itself rather than to instances of the class. An instance of a class is an object. So instance actually means object. If we go back here, I do think I put that. So yeah, these methods require you to create an object. Remember, an object is an instance of the class. That's why they're called instance methods back here, because they rely on objects. Static methods don't rely on instances, aka objects of the class. They belong to the whole class itself. So static methods can be called without creating an object of the class. This is the opposite to instance methods. So to make a method static, you actually have to tell Java that it's static and use the static keyword. That sits between the access modifier, if there is one, and the return type. Return type access modifier. Static goes right in between. So yeah, if you want to make a method static, you have to use a static keyword. And this is telling Java, hey, I don't need an object to use this method. I just want to use a method without objects. So why would you make, a method static? Well, make your method static if it does not depend on the state of an object. We'll kind of touch on that a little bit more as we move through these slides. But yeah, if you don't actually need to depend on an object to hold on to the information, then make it static. So static keyword is placed between the access modifier and return type. We already said that. So these static methods are called, without creating an object. Again, that's the opposite to instance methods. So yeah, here's a syntax example, right? We threw the static right there. So now get random greeting, you don't need an object. And get random greeting doesn't really need an object, right? It's not relying on the data. This entire method can exist on its own. It doesn't need the information from an object to do anything because everything it does is inside here. It has all the values here. It doesn't even take inputs. So this is a good example of a static method. We're gonna touch more upon when to make things static, when to make things instance methods later in this lesson, and a further deep dive right in the next lesson. But just note syntax for calling from inside the class, method name and args. There's no, special rules or anything. So static methods are a little bit easier when it comes to calling them. If you are calling them from outside the class, instead of an object name, you actually do the whole class name. So yeah, if we modified all the example methods to be static, so let's say we went back to all these methods here, calculate, or we didn't do calculate dog age, we do check temperature, double two numbers. If we threw a static, right, in those method declarations on all of them, then if we wanted to call them, it looks a little different. Because we're in the same class, we're allowed to use the shorter method name. So notice we just say check temperature. We didn't have to do app.check temperature. We just do double two numbers. We didn't have to do app.double two numbers. We just do print names. We didn't have to do app.print names. We just do get random greeting. We didn't need an object in front of it. We didn't have to do app.get random greeting. In fact, there's no object at all. Last time we had, main app, equals new main. We don't have to do that because these are all static methods. So we're allowed to use the shorthand version because um, the idea is we created these in the main class. These were all created down here, maybe like under, our main method. So we define them inside the main file. So if it's in the main file, right, it's in the main class. Technically, you can actually have multiple classes in one file, but that's for another class. But yeah, if you created these in the main file, then you can use the shorthand. And yeah, it's a lot shorter syntax, a lot easier to call on these methods. If you wanted to, you could go with the longer syntax. You could do main dot and then the method name, right? Main dot check temperature. Main dot double two numbers. Main with the capital letter, right? Because it's the class name. You do main dot print names. That works too. That works just fine. It won't give you any errors. You don't have to use a shorter version. But definitely the shorter version looks nicer, right? So when you can use a shorter version, go for it. But if you're not comfortable doing the shorter version just yet, you could definitely go with a class name for static method.